Act 1. The Fire on Christmas Eve. In the heart of West Virginia, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, lies the town of Fayetteville. In the 1940s, it was a bustling coal town, a place of hard work and close-knit communities, many of them made up of immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. The Sodder family was one such story of immigrant success. George Sodder, an Italian immigrant who had arrived in the U.S. as a young boy, had built a prosperous trucking company from the ground up. He and his wife, Jennie, a proud Italian-American, were respected figures in the community. They had a large, beautiful home and an even larger, more beautiful family, 10 children in total. They were a lively, happy, and loving family, the embodiment of the American dream. But on Christmas Eve of 1945, as the world was celebrating the end of a long and brutal war, the Sodder family's dream would be consumed by a mysterious, devastating fire, igniting one of the most baffling and heartbreaking unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Christmas Eve at the Sodder home was a joyous occasion. 9 of the 10 children were at home. The eldest son, Joe, was away serving in the army. The younger children, excited by the new toys their older sister Marion had bought them, begged their mother to let them stay up late. Jennie, tired from the day's preparations, agreed on the condition that the older boys, 14-year-old John and 9-year-old George Jr., remember to put the cows in and feed the chickens before they went to bed. She then retired to her own bedroom with George and their youngest child, 2-year-old Sylvia. The night, however, was punctuated by a series of strange and unsettling events. Around 9 p.m., a phone call came. It was a wrong number, but the woman on the other end had a strange, weird laugh. Around 12:30 a.m., Jennie was woken again, this time by a loud bang on the roof, followed by the sound of a heavy object rolling down. She dismissed it as nothing and went back to sleep. An hour later, at 1:30 a.m., she woke up for a third time. This time, she smelled smoke. The house was on fire. What followed was a scene of pure chaos and terror. Jennie woke George, and they both began screaming for their children. The house was filling with thick, black smoke with an unnatural speed. George, Jennie, and 4 of their children who slept downstairs, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., managed to escape the burning inferno. But 5 of their children, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jennie, and 5-year-old Betty, were trapped in the upstairs attic bedrooms. Their father, George Sodder, in a desperate, frantic attempt to save them, raced to find his ladder, which he always kept propped against the side of the house. In a baffling twist, the ladder was gone. It was not in its usual spot. It was later found, inexplicably, in an embankment over 75 feet away. His next desperate plan was to drive one of his large work trucks up to the house and climb on top of it to reach the attic window. But inexplicably, neither of his 2 trucks, which had been working perfectly the day before, would start. The engines just wouldn't turn over. Meanwhile, a neighbor tried to call the fire department, but the phone line was dead. Another neighbor had to drive into town to alert the fire chief in person. Due to the late hour in the all-volunteer fire department, the response was tragically slow. By the time the fire truck arrived, hours later, the Sodder family home was nothing but a smoking, smoldering pile of ash. As the heartbroken family stood in the snow, watching their home and their lives burn to ground, they clung to a devastating assumption. They and the authorities believed that the 5 children trapped in the attic had perished in the fire. It was a horrific, unthinkable tragedy. But as the days turned into weeks, a series of strange discoveries, or rather, a lack of discoveries, would begin to turn this tragic accident into a profound and enduring mystery. Act 2, The Ashes of Doubt. As the cold Christmas morning dawned, the Sodder family stood shattered, gazing at the smoldering ruins of their home. The official consensus was clear. A terrible, tragic accident had occurred. The fire, they presumed, had been caused by faulty wiring, and it had burned so intensely and so quickly that the 5 children trapped in the attic bedrooms had been incinerated, their bodies turned to ash. The local fire chief, F.J. Morris, informed the grieving George Sodder that there was no point in a thorough search. There would be nothing to find. For 5 days, the family was left in a state of shock and unimaginable grief. The death certificates for the 5 missing children were issued on December 30th. For the town of Fayetteville, the case was closed. But for George and Jennie Sodder, the nightmare was just beginning, and it was being fueled by a growing, terrible doubt. The first seeds of suspicion were planted by the series of bizarre events on the night of the fire. The strange phone call, the sound on the roof, the missing ladder, the trucks that wouldn't start, and the dead phone line. Individually, they could be dismissed as coincidences. But together, they painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated act of sabotage. George Sodder, a man of logic and practicality, could not shake the feeling that the fire was not an accident. It was arson, and if it was arson, then the disappearance of his children might not be a simple tragedy. It might be a kidnapping. This suspicion turned into a full-blown obsession when the official investigation began to unravel. The fire chief claimed to have found a heart in the ashes, which he had secretly buried in a box. But when this heart was later examined, it was found to be a beef liver, completely untouched by the fire. The explanation was that the chief had buried it in an attempt to comfort the family, to give them a sense of closure. But for the Sodders, it was a profound betrayal, a sign that the investigation was either incompetent or corrupt. Jennie Sodder, unable to accept that her children had been turned to ash, began conducting her own grim experiments. She would burn small animal bones, chickens, cows, to see if the fire could completely destroy them. No matter how hot the fire, some bone fragments always remained. She consulted an expert at a local crematorium, who confirmed her findings. A house fire, even one of intense heat, would not be hot enough to completely obliterate the skeletal remains of 5 children. Bones would have been left behind. Yet, a thorough private search of the ashes of their home yielded absolutely nothing. No bones, no teeth, no sign of human remains whatsoever. Then, more strange clues began to surface. A telephone repairman confirmed that the Sodders' phone line had not been burned through. It had been deliberately cut. A witness came forward claiming to have seen a man stealing the ladder from the Sodders' property on the night of the fire. Another witness claimed to have seen the children themselves, peering from a passing car while the house was in flames. The Sodders began to believe that the fire was merely a diversion, a smokescreen to cover up the abduction of their 5 children. But who would do such a thing and why? George Sodder's mind turned to his past. He was an outspoken critic of the Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, and he had gotten into frequent, heated arguments with other members of the town's Italian immigrant community over politics. He recalled a chilling threat from a life insurance salesman months earlier who, after being rebuffed, had warned him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. At the time, he had dismissed it. Now, it seemed like a terrifying prophecy. Act 3. The Billboard and the Investigator. Frustrated by what they saw as a corrupt and incompetent local investigation, George and Jennie Sodder decided to take matters into their own hands. They were no longer just grieving parents. They had become relentless detectives, driven by the unwavering belief that at least some of their children were still alive. They began to spend their life savings on the search, first hiring a private investigator from a nearby town. The investigator, a man named C.C. Tinsley, uncovered a number of disturbing facts. He learned that the fire chief, F.J. Morris, had a personal connection to the insurance salesman who had threatened George Sodder. Tinsley also heard a bizarre rumor that the fire chief himself had found the heart-like object, not in the ashes, but had planted it there from a piece of fresh beef liver. The implication was shocking. that the official investigation was not just incompetent, but was actively trying to cover something up to force the family to accept the accidental fire narrative. The Sodders, now more convinced than ever of foul play, took an extraordinary step. In 1952, they erected a large, stark billboard on Route 16 near their former home. It bore the images of their 5 missing children, their smiling faces a haunting contrast to the grim story. The billboard offered a $5,000 reward, later doubled to $10,000, for any information leading to the children's recovery. It was a permanent public declaration of their belief, a silent accusation aimed at a town they felt had failed them. The billboard became a local landmark, a constant, chilling reminder of the mystery that lingered over Fayetteville. It would remain there for nearly 40 years, until Jennie Sodder's death. The billboard brought in a flood of tips and alleged sightings from all over the country. The Sodders meticulously followed up on every single lead, no matter how far-fetched. There was a report from a woman in St. Louis who claimed to have seen the children in the company of a man and a woman. There was a letter from a woman in Texas claiming that one of the older boys, Lewis, had been seen there. One of the most intriguing sightings came from a woman who ran a hotel in Charleston. She claimed to have seen the children about a week after the fire. They arrived late at night with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction. The woman said the group was secretive and hostile, and she had the distinct impression that the children were being held against their will. George Sodder traveled the country, chasing these ghosts. He would drive thousands of miles to investigate a single tip, show his children's pictures to strangers, his heart filled with a desperate hope. But each lead ultimately led to a dead end, another heartbreaking disappointment. The trail always went cold. The most tantalizing and ultimately most heartbreaking clue arrived 20 years after the fire. In 1967, Jennie Sodder received a letter in the mail, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his mid-20s. He bore a striking resemblance to her son Lewis, who would have been around that age. On the back of the photograph was a cryptic, handwritten message. Lewis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Illo boys, a 90132 or 35. The message was bizarre and nonsensical, but the photograph was electrifying. For the Sodders, it was the proof they had been waiting for, a sign that at least one of their children was alive. They hired another private detective to investigate the letter and the photograph. The detective, however, after taking their money, vanished without a trace, and they were never able to find him again. They added the updated photograph of Lewis to their billboard, a new face of hope amidst the old tragedy. But the identity of the young man in the photo and the meaning of the cryptic message has never been discovered. It was another piece of a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. Act 4, the unyielding logic of father. As the years turned into decades, George Sodder's personal investigation became a masterclass in relentless, logical deduction. He was not a man swayed by emotion or wild speculation. He was a practical man, and the facts, as he saw them, simply did not add up. He compiled a list of inconsistencies, a litany of evidence that convinced him beyond any doubt that his children had been abducted. The fire itself was the first major inconsistency. The official explanation was that it was caused by faulty wiring. But George had recently had the entire house rewired by a reputable company, and he had it inspected and declared safe. He also pointed out that the Christmas lights, which were initially blamed, were still working when the fire started. If they had caused a short, they would have gone out. The intensity and speed of the fire also troubled him. His house was a large, timber-frame building. A normal house fire would have taken much longer to consume the entire structure. The fact that his home was reduced to nothing but its basement foundation in just 45 minutes suggested the use of an accelerant, a substance like gasoline or kerosene, designed to make the fire burn hotter and faster. This was further supported by the strange, rubbery object Jennie had found in the yard a few days before the fire, which a neighbor speculated was a pineapple bomb, a type of incendiary device. Then there was a profound and enduring mystery of the missing remains. This became the cornerstone of George and Jennie's belief. They could not and would not accept that a fire had simply vaporized their 5 children. To prove his point, George, in his final, desperate attempt to find the truth, brought in a private pathologist from Washington, D.C. to re-excavate the site of his former home. They conducted a meticulous, archaeological-style dig of the basement. The results were stunning. They found several small artifacts that had survived the blaze, a few coins, a partially burned dictionary. But what they did not find was a single human bone fragment, not one vertebra, not one tooth. The pathologist's report was unequivocal. There was no evidence that any human beings had died in the fire. The Sodders also never stopped questioning the bizarre series of events that had crippled their ability to save their children. The missing ladder, found thrown in an embankment. The 2 trucks, both of which had been in perfect working order, suddenly refusing to start. George, a mechanic by trade, suspected tampering. And the cut phone line was a clear and undeniable act of sabotage. This was not a string of bad luck. This was a coordinated, deliberate effort to ensure the fire would be devastating, and that any rescue attempt would be impossible. All of this evidence, when pieced together, created a narrative that was far more sinister than a simple house fire. It was a story of a planned attack. Someone had cut the phone line. Someone had possibly tampered with the trucks. Someone had stolen the ladder. Someone had thrown an incendiary device onto the roof to start the fire. And while the family was distracted by the flames and the chaos, someone had abducted the 5 children from their beds. But the question remained, who and why? The motive was as elusive as the children themselves. Act 5, an unending vigil. George and Jennie Sodder would spend the rest of their lives searching for their lost children. Their story is one of the most profound and heartbreaking examples of parental love and unending hope in the face of absolute uncertainty. They never rebuilt their home on the same spot, instead turning the land into a memorial garden for their missing children. And at the edge of their property, the billboard stood as a silent, constant sentinel, its 5 hopeful faces staring out at the passing traffic, a public plea for answers that would never come. The Sodders' primary theory was that their children had been kidnapped by someone connected to the Italian Mafia, as retaliation for George's vocal anti-Mussolini sentiments. They believed the local law enforcement was either complicit or too intimidated to investigate properly. This theory, while never proven, would explain the apparent sabotage on the night of the fire and the subsequent cover-up they perceived. As the years went by, George and Jennie grew old, but their search never faltered. They followed every lead, investigated every sighting. Jennie meticulously maintained a scrapbook of every article, every letter, every piece of information related to the case. She wore black for the rest of her life, a symbol of her unending mourning. George's health eventually failed. But even on his deathbed in 1969, his primary concern was the mystery that consumed his life. He had never wavered in his belief that the children had not died in the fire. After his death, Jennie and her surviving children continued the vigil. The billboard remained up. They continued to offer a reward. But the trail grew colder with each passing year. The photograph of the young man, allegedly Lewis, which arrived in 1967, was the last significant clue they would ever receive. Despite their efforts, they could never trace its origin. Jennie Sodder passed away in 1989. After her death, the remaining Sodder children finally took down the weathered, time-worn billboard. For nearly 40 years, it had stood as a monument to their family's hope and heartbreak. The last surviving Sodder child from that fateful night Sylvia is now an old woman. She was only 2 years old at the time of the fire, but she has spent her entire life in the shadow of the mystery, helping her parents and siblings in their quest for answers. To this day, the surviving Sodder descendants continue to believe that their lost relatives were not killed in the fire and may have lived out their lives somewhere else, perhaps with new identities, never knowing the family that never stopped searching for them. The mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance endures. Was it a tragic freak accident, a series of unbelievable coincidences, or was it a sinister, well-planned abduction, covered up by a devastating fire and a corrupt investigation? The evidence is a tantalizing mix of the mundane and the bizarre. The truth remains buried under the ashes of a Christmas fire, a secret that has been kept for over 75 years, a heartbreaking testament to a family's unending search for 5 children who vanished into the smoke.